Well, look, thank you, everyone. We might make a start. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Professor Peter Ashworth from the Curtin Institute for Energy Transition, and we're very excited to be hosting Professor Clark Miller from Arizona State University. He'll be talking about which future will we build, the critical importance of design choices in the decarbonisation of energy systems. So I'm very fortunate to have Clark, but before we sort of kick off, I would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk elders, past, present and future, as the traditional owners of the Noongar Budja, on which Curtin Institute is based. And we acknowledge the tens and thousands of years of Indigenous knowledge, culture and insight into living sustainably and caring for the natural world. I'm very excited about the prospects of energy transition in enabling for traditional owners as rights holders to participate, which will be very exciting moving forward. So just a little bit background. Clark is a theorist and designer of techno-human futures in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State, where he is a professor and director of the Center for Energy and Society. And his work explores how the decarbonisation of energy systems can be leveraged as an instrument of human progress and uplift at this critical moment in history. And I've had the great fortune of knowing Clark for many years now, done some wonderful walks through Arizona with him, looking for birds. And I don't think we could have a better person to kickstart the year. So I'll hand over to you, Clark. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peta. It's great to be here, and great to be coming to Australia next week and hang out with folks at CSIRO for a couple of days and talk energy transitions. And so I really appreciate you giving me this chance to kick off this engagement with an opportunity to kind of give a fairly high-level talk around this topic that I've selected. So let me share my screen here quick and pop up my slides. So can you all see that? Okay, great. So what I wanted to do was to really take a shot at something that has come out of our work in Arizona over the last 15 years, looking at pathways to deep decarbonization. And I've also been recently part of the National Academy's committee that's produced two big reports on accelerating decarbonization of the US energy system. And I think one of the things that's increasingly clear about decarbonization and the push for carbon neutrality is that, well, I don't know if I've ever quite said it this way, but I think we're potentially at risk of losing sight of where we're trying to go in a push to get there as fast as we possibly can. And of course, I think that makes a lot of sense. I understand why there is a lot of pressure to push hard on the energy transition to decarbonize as rapidly as possible. It's a big, enormous system. It's likely to take decades to get a transition to carbon neutrality done. I know it feels to a lot of people, and especially young people, that we haven't made much progress to date. And as a result, there's just an enormous amount of concern that we're not going to get it done. We're not going to get it done in time. And as a result, we're going to get swamped by changes to the climate. And I get all that. At the same time, what I want to try to argue in this talk is that because of the fundamentally central role that energy technological systems have played in the construction of our modern world, and the specific ways in which we have adapted human systems and energy systems to each other in the past, we have arrived at a moment where the constitution of our energy systems, in a sense, is socially and economically extraordinarily important. And in transitioning to a carbon neutral energy future, we have a unique opportunity, in a sense, to reconstitute the kind of social and economic foundations of modern societies, and to open up a question about where we want to go, what future we want to build, at the same time that we're asking the question, how can we get there, and how can we get there as fast as possible? And I want to try to make the argument here today fairly quickly that it really does matter. This question of design choices, this question of what are we choosing to build, where are we choosing to go as we push for a clean energy transition. So I want to start that conversation with this picture. This picture is a neighborhood in Phoenix. It's a fairly attractive photo. It was taken, I assume, by a drone by one of our big electric utilities here in the valley, and I found it on their website. And it's obviously a picture of houses with solar panels on their roofs. And what I want to suggest by asking this question, what's going on here, is that it's not at all clear from the picture itself what future this represents. So let me tell you 3 different stories very quickly about what's going on in this picture. So in the first story that I'm going to tell you, there are people who live in these houses, and the people who live in these houses own the houses. And they also own the solar systems on top of their roofs. And they are engaged at a minimum in selling the excess electricity from these rooftop systems back to their electric utility. Perhaps they're even in the future engaged in peer-to-peer energy trading. And I want to suggest that this future that I've just described is a libertarian vision of the future of, in my case, the United States, although I suspect there are similar neighborhoods in Australia, right? It's a libertarian in the sense that each of these households is an independent individual economic agent or unit. Each is a generator of economic activity. In this case, they're an owner of assets, houses, and solar panels. Those assets produce economically valuable stuff, in this case, green electrons. Those green electrons can be bought and sold, right? And this is all part of how a libertarian conceptualization of the economy looks like, right? So I want to give you a different story about what might be going on in this picture. In this second story, the people who live in these houses, people live in the houses just like they did in the first story, but they don't own the houses. They rent the houses. So who owns the houses? Well, Wall Street banks own the houses. And in fact, in Phoenix, we have tracts and tracts and tracts of suburban neighborhoods like this one that are owned by Wall Street banks and rented out to renters. And there's solar panels on the roofs, just like there were in the first story, but those solar panels are not owned by the people who live in the houses. Those solar panels are owned by Elon Musk. So Elon Musk owns a company called Tesla, which absorbed a company called Solar City, which was started by his cousins. And that company, Solar City, was one of the early pioneers of leased solar systems. And so they borrow money from big banks and they buy lots and lots of solar panels. And they go out and they lease rooftops from the owners of houses, in this case, Wall Street banks. They lease the space because it's empty space, right? Rooftops are not being used, so we might as well lease it. We'll put solar panels down. The vision of Solar City was to become the largest electric utility in the United States, meaning to own the largest amount of electricity generating technologies ever assembled by a single company in the United States. This is what we understand now to be a neoliberal vision of the future of the economy, right? It's a rentier economy. It's an economy in which no one owns anything except for large corporate asset companies, right? And instead, we all rent services. We rent spaces to live. We rent electricity from our electric utilities, right? It's a fairly classic notion of a kind of rentier model of an economy. So let me suggest a third model of what's going on here. And that is drawing on especially European initiatives at the moment to build energy cooperatives. We might imagine that there's a neighborhood cooperative that has purchased solar panels in large quantities so that it can get as low a price as possible on those panels. It has had them collectively installed throughout the neighborhood so that the installation prices can be lower than if it's in an individual purchasing model. And most importantly of all, the co-op collectively sells the electricity in a way that maximizes the revenue stream for the community, and that those revenues then go back into neighborhood projects to benefit the community as a whole. And in some ways, also quite importantly, in this, you can take advantage of not only the people who happen to own homes in the neighborhood, but also the people who rent homes in the neighborhood can all participate in this collective activity, and they can all benefit from the revenue streams and other benefits that come from participating in this solar project. So just to, emphasize, right, if you imagine this neighborhood scaled out to the United States of America, right, 100+ million households, you understand that these three different futures, all described by exactly the same houses, exactly the same solar panels, exactly the same wires, but layered into the cultural and economic fabric of the country in very different ways. Those futures are radically different from each other, right? And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the design choices that are implicit in and inherent in building a green energy future. We choose, in some collective sense, which kinds of clean energy, green energy, sustainable energy futures we want to build. We set the rules. At least we pretend we do if we're democratic societies. And so that then I think is the kind of big picture challenge of trying to think about how do we direct where we're going in this clean energy transition at the same time that we work to make sure that we accelerate the clean energy transition to meet the timetables that we all know that we have to meet. So the argument is there are many possible carbon neutral futures. Solar is a fantastic space within which to work and think about these kinds of problems because there are literally on the planet 9 orders of magnitude between the smallest solar systems that we use on pocket calculators, for example, and the largest solar systems that we've designed, these gigawatt scale solar fields like you see in the background picture, and everything in between. And then when we think about the ways that we can take these differently sized solar systems and configure them in relationship to other devices, so other ways that we use the energy, a solar calculator is dramatically different than an electric power plant. Think about ways that we connect these with devices like storage technologies, right? And the configuration of solar and storage possibilities. And then think about how you layer these into the social, the economic, and the cultural fabric of society. You've got an amazing array of possibilities in terms of the kinds of futures that you can build globally and locally. And that's what I think is so exciting about the clean energy transition, but also such an important topic to really focus on. So, these choices that we'll make will have profound implications for the future of planetary ecosystems. If you just ask the question, where are we going to put 200 billion solar panels down on the planet? Are we going to grade the dirt and the surface underneath them? I was just in the middle of an argument a couple of weeks ago in which my parents, who, as Petta said earlier, are birders and love to go out and find birds. We're arguing with a giant solar developer who's decided to grade an important bird nesting area underneath a set of solar panels. If we grade the area under 200 billion solar panels, it's just a dramatically different future for the planet and the biodiversity of the planet than if we find other places and other ways of putting those 200 billion solar panels down. And of course, the material stuff that goes into those solar panels also, has implications for planetary ecosystems in a variety of different ways when we scale out to the scale of the solar industry that we're going to have to build in order to get to a clean energy future. It has implications for global political economy and security. All that big stuff around oil for the last century, wars, conflict, right? Political economic maneuvering on the global stage, right? That doesn't go away in a clean energy future. And we need to think about how we're going to approach this set of issues as an important set of design configurations. And if there are ways to create the kinds of political economies that we think we might want to create. If you think about the energy economy at the moment, it's a giant economy for moving carbon in one direction from the sites where we take it out of the ground to the places where we burn it in order to do useful work. But flowing backwards along those same pathways is money, right? And so if you think about the carbon industries, they've been fairly concentrated industries in terms of how they move wealth in the world, move wealth away from people at the edges and towards people at the center of these enormous socio-technological systems for mining and refining and transporting and consuming carbon-based energy resources. Right? And so one can ask the same question about the kinds of solar energy futures that one is building in the world. And one of the interesting features of solar is precisely the flexibility of ownership regimes that are possible in a future solar economy. And so opening up the question, can we build a solar energy future that has a different kind of political economy attached to it than the one that we've been living in for the past century? How we live and how we work each day. I don't think a lot of people are sort of aware of two, kind of really interesting and important facts about the way we live and work in the modern world. The first is that it has been shaped in fundamental ways by the electricity regime and by the way that electricity technologies work. Big thermal power plants like coal plants and more recently nuclear and gas plants, especially combined cycle gas plants, right, have a certain characteristic to them that they, from an economic perspective and a technological perspective, just want to produce electricity all the time. And it's actually quite hard, especially for coal and nuclear plants, to ramp them up and ramp them down. They like to produce the same amount of electricity all the time. And that has created a pricing regime in which we have surpluses of electricity at night when most people don't want to use it, and we have scarcity of electricity in the daytime when people do want to use it. So we have high electricity prices in the day and cheap electricity prices at night. And that has structured because of various things the electricity industry has done over the last 100 years to try to drive electricity use towards the nighttime regime that has helped create the 24/7, 365 culture that we live in. I could say more about it in the Q&A period, but the other important fact is that as we move towards more and more solar on our grids, and solar is going to be important virtually everywhere on the planet as a key kind of renewable resource in the future. But we're already seeing it here in Arizona because our neighbors in California have 30% solar on their grid. And so during a fairly substantial fraction of the year now, we live in a world in which electricity is not only not expensive in the middle of the day, it's negatively priced in the middle of the day. The California Independent System Operator will pay you to use electricity at noon. And the reason is because they have such a surplus of solar electrons. So solar electricity, as it becomes grid significant, is going to shift our pricing regimes from expensive during the day and cheap at night to cheap during the day and expensive at night. And the kind of cultural and economic transformations that will come with that over the course of the next 25 years, the next 50 years, are unknown, but I think potentially very significant in terms of reshaping how we think about ordinary, everyday, day-to-day practices of living and working, and the relationship between those and the price of electricity on our grid. Who and where we sacrifice is another area of implication, right? I mean, obviously, one of the upsides of a renewable energy revolution is that clean energy technologies are in some ways significantly more clean than the carbon-based ones that they're replacing. So we kind of get a lot of advantage and upside just from that. But nonetheless, there is still mining. There is still a material economy associated with a clean energy economy. And choices that we make about how to build out that material economy, the supply chains, the mining, the kinds of technologies that we build and the kinds of materials that they use will have consequences for the geographies of social, economic, and environmental sacrifice that come with this new economy. And again, one of the central questions that we confront is whether we can design a clean energy future in which we attend to those questions in an anticipatory, upfront, just way, rather than simply letting them happen as we have done, and then neglecting them, ignoring them, suppressing knowledge of them as we have done in the energy economies of the past. And so many more different ways in which these choices that we have to make will have deep implications for the futures that we live in. So I think we have a unique opportunity and responsibility in the clean energy economy and in our design of it to redesign the human relationship with technology. We've been exploring some ways to kind of try to begin thinking about that. The Weight of Light was a book that we did a few years ago. We've subsequently done a sequel to it called Cities of Light that tried to tell stories, human stories, people-centered stories about what it would be like to live under different kinds of solar energy futures. And this picture is artwork from one of those stories, Divided Light, by Corey Pressman. It's a kind of Romeo and Juliet story in which these two young people from two very different cultures that are centered in two very different ways of capturing, using, and consuming solar energy come into contact with one another. Of course, because it's Romeo and Juliet, fall in love, but their families, who are, sort of key leaders in these two very different solar economies, are never happy with this relationship that they built. Just sort of illustrating why and how we can begin to explore what it means to live in different kinds of relationship with a technology like solar energy. And of course, as a consequence, relationship with each other and with the world around us at the same time. So these techno-human choices that we confront are not just questions about what am I going to do with my solar panel, but as that first slide suggested with the neighborhood, there are questions about how I'm going to relate to my neighbors, how I'm going to relate to major economic actors in the world, and so forth. So really the argument I'm trying to make is that the energy system is core to have how we have created the world that we live in at the present. We live in an electrified world. Let nobody ever tell you that electrification is something to be done in the future. It is something that has been done already. We live in a deeply electrified world. That electrified world is shaped by the fact that it is powered by large thermal power plants like coal plants and nuclear plants that dominate the Arizona grid and many, many grids around the world, that organize labor as part of what they do, that organize education. I would remind you that on many, many campuses, the electrical engineering department is the largest department on campus and often has the most number of students because electricity is so central to the modern economy. We had to invent a whole new wing of education in order to make this world possible and design it. And so to redesign energy is once again to remake who we can be as human beings and what kinds of lives and kinds of societies and kinds of economies that we want to live in. So now is, for me, the moment to privilege our capacity to imagine different kinds of futures, and especially to imagine futures that we would actually want to live in, that would be worth living in. It's a moment to privilege critical inquiry into the meanings and impacts of techno-human systems. We need to understand how energy has structured the world that we live in, how emerging forms of clean energy economies are already beginning to structure the worlds that are emerging, and how to think about critically why it would matter if we designed the clean energy future in way A, version A versus version B versus version C. And that is an exercise in which I think, for example, the kinds of scholarship that we've done in fields like science and technology studies is so absolutely important to building out these futures that we're proposing. And finally, right now is the moment to actually take seriously a notion that many people have grappled with for a half a century of how do we do democracy and justice with respect to the making of new technologies? How do we make sure that the kinds of technologies and the kinds of techno-human relationships that we build into the future are informed by our ideas about what it means to govern ourselves democratically and justly? So what's going on here in this picture is, for me, emblematic of a host of similar kinds of questions across the clean energy space. And I hope that you will all join me in engaging deeply and critically in this question and how to move it forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Clark. A great sort of teaser for us to think about. I'm just sort of thinking, as you were starting to move forward in the designing of futures, what are some of the things that you're engaging with at Arizona, at ASU, with your group and beyond?
Yeah, some really interesting pieces of the puzzle. So we did a big study of what are the different pathways to a clean energy economy in Arizona, trying to begin to unpack what it would mean for the state to move forward along a hydrogen pathway, a carbon capture and sequestration pathway, an electrification pathway, and then we had a pathway, a fourth pathway that we called the left behind pathway. The idea behind all of this was that we kind of have a sense of how the first 80% of carbon emissions are going to be eliminated, but the final 20% is a kind of real hard problem in the state of Arizona. I mean, we've got already some of the largest semiconductor manufacturing facilities in the world, and we're building the two biggest of the future on opposite sides of the city, TSMC and Intel,
Right. Yeah.
And we're going to have to power them, right? And we're going to have to power them 24/7, 365. We're building AI data centers left and right across the city, right? And so that final 20% is really hard. So what does it look like to do that? We did another exercise that was, everybody's engaged in the question, where are we going to build the next 100 electric vehicle chargers or the next 1,000 electric vehicle chargers? And we said, well, wait a minute, let's stop a minute and ask the question, how are we going to charge 5 million vehicles in Phoenix in 2050? And that turned out to be super interesting question, because the next 1,000 electric vehicle chargers in Phoenix are going to be built in one place. They're going to be built in people's garages. And guess what? Those cars are not going to be in those garages when the sun is shining. And so as we build out a clean energy grid in Arizona, where we don't have any wind, it's all solar all the time, right? So if we build out that solar grid and we build out chargers for people's cars in their garages where they park in the middle of the night, we're also going to have to build a whole second set of batteries to move the power from noon to midnight. I mean, so we're like, wait, we have to intervene. And so now this has actually generated a whole bunch of policy initiatives to try to figure out, can we actually intervene in the construction of the charging infrastructure? And it's not an easy question to figure out, because the auto manufacturers want to know one thing, which is how can they make sure that every person who buys an electric car has a charger that they can access. And so they're all building them in people's garages, because that's the first stop. Of course, that leaves off 42% of Arizonans who don't have a garage.
Yeah.
They rent. They don't own a garage. So they are at the moment excluded from the major dominant modality of EV adoption, right? So anyways, it just was a super interesting kind of exercise. So we're doing these various kinds of things to try to look forward into the future, and explore these different design choices and what they mean, and then how to think about how do you engage the different actors and the different groups and the different communities in a conversation productively about which direction should we go, which is also not easy.
Well, I might just continue on that, because one of the things that I find is, the decision makers, the policy people that you refer to, how hard was it to actually have them engage on, and actually buy into this sort of thought process from your perspective? There's a lot of discussion here in Australia about universities and their role. Just interested in that, and then I'll go to some of the questions online. And people, if you've got questions, please put them in the chat under the Q&A.
So what we find is that it's extraordinarily easy to engage people so long as they're not the people at the top. And the people at the top, it's really hard, right? So we can get the city of Phoenix, we can get everybody up to the chief sustainability officer anytime we want them.
Yeah.
To come to one of these events. But the mayor, totally different story. City council, totally different story. Similarly, we can get anybody at the utility, because they're deeply engaged in trying to figure out how to get to carbon neutrality. This is not an easy question. And by the way, they have to grow. I mean, we're going to triple electricity consumption in Phoenix by 2050, between economic growth, population growth, electrification of industry, and electrification of transportation. We're going to triple. They've never built power plants that fast, and they've never built solar and storage as the primary mechanism for producing that electricity. They've no idea if this is all going to work. But they're moving down this path. So we can get anybody we want in the electric utility, except the CEO, right? The person who ultimately calls the shots. It's very hard to get them in the room. And so we have to think a little bit about how do we engage the very top?
Yeah.
Because everybody who's a problem solver, right, who's embedded in these processes from the point of view of figure out how to get this done, is super excited about participating.
I think we probably see a little bit of that, and you do need those the decision makers to actually move things forward. So I'm going to go to some of the questions in the Q&A, and I've got another one I might come back to depending on time, but this is something we were sort of mooted. Has any research been done on pros and cons of decentralized power grid? Would the savings in maintaining a grid be a factor in that? And would it provide consumers with protection from increasing severe weather events? There's a lot going on here at the moment about the need to build out transmission and, the opposition. So your thoughts?
Yeah, well, we're having exactly the same conversation here. The current, the Biden administration is at one level, they have an all of the above strategy, but it's very clear nonetheless that they believe that we must build out a massive transmission infrastructure that dwarfs what we have at present, that we have to be able to move renewable power long distances, and that prioritizing grid modernization and grid stability and grid reliability is the route to protecting people from extreme events due to climate change. This in the face of escalating grid failures across the country in all different kinds of locations as a result of climate extremes. And so we are beginning a conversation here. I'm sure it's beginning elsewhere about how to supplement grid reliability with grid resilience and thinking about redundancy and thinking about microgrids and thinking about the ability to build an additional layer. There has been one big study done a few years ago that looked at the cost of solar in cities versus solar in the countryside. So obviously we all know that if you look simply from the question of power plant construction and installation, and you build a utility scale plant, it will be 1/3 the price per watt of building them on individually house by house on people's rooftops. But there's no reason to build them house by house. You can do better than that, financially and economically. But it turns out that comparison is only valid so long as you have an existing transmission line that moves the power to the city. And if you have to build a transmission line to move the power to the city, the costs level out pretty quickly. And so it's not clear that power plants out. So the challenge is that if you look at utility accounting systems, they're different buckets of money. Your power plant gets bucketed over here and your transmission line gets bucketed over here. And so you don't do a systems cost comparison. And that's the kind of stuff that we need to do. Our utility, fortunately, where I live, we have two in Phoenix, but the one on the east side where I live has switched over from an integrated resource planning approach to an integrated system planning approach, and they are building out the modeling capability to do full systems comparisons of different scenarios. And when that capability is built, they should be able to do a pairwise comparison between building out distributed solar in a city versus building out utility scale solar in the countryside in a completely equivalent fashion, accounting for everything. But we just don't have the modeling capabilities at the moment. But it's, people are also looking at the other side. That assumes that that comparison still assumes that the only thing coming out of those solar panels is green electrons, right? But if the things coming out of those solar panels are shade over a walkway or a seating area, if the things coming out of those solar panels are mitigation of an urban heat island effect, if it's shading cars and making it not really hot in people's cars when they get into them, if it's grid resilience because we're building them out in microgrids, then it's a totally different calculation, and the value proposition for urban solar becomes much higher than the value proposition for colonizing more rural landscapes just to put solar panels down.
Yeah, it sounds like very similar conversations that are going on here. Dean Sharafi, who's from our energy market operator, said, thanks for a great presentation. He's focused on electricity shaping our current lifestyle. Do you think we can continue the same lifestyle and decarbonise at the same time? He wonders if it's a difficult one to maintain.
It's a great question. One of the things that reducing the price of electricity at night in order to stimulate nighttime demand, one of the things that utilities did was specifically market those low prices to manufacturers. And shifted us to a 2 and 3 shift manufacturing cycle, right? And that meant that the cost accounting for capital became much lower than the cost for labor. And so it helped shift. I won't say it was the only thing that contributed to the shift from labor to capital in the economy over the course of the 20th century, but it was one of the important contributing factors, right? So I asked my economist colleagues, if we flip the price of electricity, how will that impact how companies balance labor and capital in their calculations? And they say, oh, it'll never matter. The companies are too used to, working in the ways that they're working. I'm like, I'm not sure I buy it, right? I mean, these are real costs.
Yes.
And I've seen companies during downtimes when they're pushed to do cost savings, really push on energy costs. They don't do it all the time, and they don't do it especially during good times. But during bad times, they really will focus on cutting energy costs. So I think, we've toyed a little bit with some of our science fiction writers in thinking about what different ways people might adapt to different environments. I mean, if you think about batteries, what they do is basically, as soon as the sun quits powering your solar panel and you have to start using a battery, the later in the night you go, the bigger the battery that you have to have, the more advanced the battery that you have to have, and so the more expensive it becomes. So we're going to see night prices kind of incrementally go up and up and up over the course of the night. And I think that could have some real, implications. I mean, yeah, of course, rich people could continue to live nightlives, right? And so you could get a bifurcated cultural economy that way. We could just become a society of battery-loving people. We are already that in some respects. If you think about all the devices in our lives that have batteries and chargeable batteries. So there's a variety of different scenarios that I think could play out in this regard. I think partly where the question is driving is the question of, energy consumption. And obviously, if you look at places like California that have used energy prices to drive energy efficiency, they've been and Europe as well, they've been extraordinarily effective at doing so, right? And total energy consumption is much lower in those kinds of places. So I think that it depends a little bit on what I'll call the solar abundance question and how it plays out, right? I mean, just how cheap is solar energy in the future, and how abundant does it become in relationship to our current electricity regimes? I mean, obviously there we've had different places in the world that have had different levels of affordability and access to abundant electricity. I suspect that will continue, but and then the question is, how much of that energy can we capture between the hours of 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. and then make use of in affordable ways at other times of the day? But I'm sure it will have a consequence. I don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately, to tell me how it will play out. We need scenarios. We need to think about those scenarios. I fear that there will be, an end of, I mean, not that I've ever had a big power lunch or anything like that, but, I mean, eating a 90-minute lunch just doesn't use enough energy to justify
No
itself in a world
siestas.
in which all the energy is available for free at noon.
It's interesting. Some of the mining companies are actually looking at this idea of balancing. Obviously, we have solar and wind in this
Yeah.
with some backup storage, small amount of gas, and one of them is a gold company that's looking at producing a green gold. So they're actually really moving to say, how can we maximize our operations in that time of high, solar availability?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it makes
So they
perfect
are
sense.
responding.
Yeah.
Exactly. Just building on that, Tanya Ermi from Murdoch wondered about that sort of increasing prices in the nighttime, how that might affect vulnerable people that perhaps can't afford it. Do you see how that might play out to keep it equitable?
It is absolutely clear that there are all kinds of ways in which we could leave people behind in this transition if we're not careful. I suspect that nighttime pricing is not going to be the first biggest place where that happens. The first biggest place that is already happening is in the shift away from technologies where the technology is cheap and the fuel is expensive to technologies where the technology is expensive and the fuel is free because it's sunlight or wind, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is a huge problem, right? I mean, we are facing extreme heat in Phoenix that is rising rapidly due to both urban heat island effects and climate change. So we set record temperatures on 29 separate days last summer.
Mm-hmm.
We had the longest stretch of high temperatures over 110 ever recorded in the city. And we had the highest number of heat-related deaths as a result last summer.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even know, there is no data set of the age, efficiency, reliability, repair record of our air conditioners across the city. It's unbelievable. Every single death that happened indoors last summer happened in an uncooled space.
Mm.
Air conditioning is now critical infrastructure. And we have no policies. It didn't even appear in our latest statewide extreme heat preparedness plan, right? And there's a whole list of things that you could do. In some ways, the very most impactful would be to simply replace the fleet of air conditioners across the valley with high efficiency air conditioners, high efficiency heat pumps, right? It would save enormous amounts of money. It would reduce energy burdens for the most vulnerable, and it would attack our peak electricity demand problem right at the peak, because that's what the peak is. It's air conditioning in the summer, which means it would make our grid more reliable, right? And yet it's not even on the table as a kind of policy option to think about how we could do something like that. So I think this challenge that people have buying EVs, buying solar panels, buying high efficiency equipment, right? It's all the same challenge. We need to figure out how to, for disadvantaged communities, move money in time upfront so they can buy the technology and then save money over the life of the equipment. And it's not like there aren't solutions. We have bank loans, we have ESCOs, there's just all kinds of things that could be done, but we're not mobilizing these tools to make these kinds of things happen. So yeah, I suspect it will definitely be, nighttime prices will be one of the things that we have to worry about, especially for people who are in occupations or otherwise living lives that require nighttime electricity. You can imagine health devices that have to run all night where, that consumption is just required for health purposes. So how do you make sure that people have that and can afford under these new pricing regimes?
Thanks. I might go to Peter Newmans, who wanted to ask about city form and function as it relates to decarbonising oil. How important will it be to change the city to be less car dependent?
Boy, you're asking somebody from Phoenix, Arizona, a question about how do we get rid of cars?
I was wondering that. Yeah,
like
yeah.
we may be the most, I mean, maybe LA competes with us or Dubai. Dubai is unbelievably designed around this ridiculous mode of transportation known as the individual automobile. It's it is a crucial question. It came up very squarely in the middle of our conversation about pathways to deep decarbonization for the state of Arizona. Not so much around changing the existing urban landscape in major ways, because nobody thinks we can fundamentally change the layout of Phoenix in the next 20 years. But rather simply even saying we need new models of development for the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of new homes that we're planning to build. But I will say, extraordinarily difficult to kind of change that equation in the minds of the development communities. Housing construction in Phoenix is a socio-technical system of its own. And it has a certain set of characteristics, and those characteristics have been pathologies at moments like the 2008 financial crisis. And they've been, major economic drivers at other times in the city's history. But it is a system, and it is a system that is well established, and the companies know how to execute on it. And it's just, it will take major efforts to kind of change that. And it's clear it will have huge consequences for the energy requirements of the future city, depending on how you design the urban layout of the future. So, yeah. Definitely encourage people to be thinking about that, certainly for all new build. And then the other thing would be to think about how can we redesign spaces that already exist in simple, easy ways. I live in a neighborhood that's a 1 mile by 1 mile grid. All the housing is in the middle in a suburban layout, and all of the business development is on the corners. But between all of the housing and all of the business development are these very large brick fences. And if you just removed the fences, you could create walkable, housing to business relationships that wouldn't need cars. And you could reimagine those spaces without too much difficulty, right? You don't even have to move houses or buildings. You just have to remove the impediments to people walking. So that's the kind of innovation, I think, in that space that we desperately kind of need. And then how could you locate businesses in those spaces so that they were the predominant things that people take short trips to, so that instead you could walk for those short business needs or whatever, right? But again, not something we've systematically brought into thinking.
There's a few more questions. I'm just going to ask one more because we're running out of time and it's late where you are. So this was from Glenn Ryan. He said, great presentation. Should we take the French lead and apply laws like mandatory PV on car parks and the need to maintain agricultural capability for field arrays to reduce the food power competition?
So I live in a state where the motto of the state government is to lead from behind with the least possible action. I have no idea whether that's familiar to Australians or not. But I will tell you, we are not, under any circumstances in Arizona, going to mandate solar on car parks. So we're going to have to make it valuable. We're going to have to demonstrate to people that there's value. And then we're going to have to open up creative pathways for them to take advantage of that value, whether that's a public value or a market value of different kinds, if we're going to get this to happen. But I think that's exactly the kind of thinking that we need to be doing. I mean, we've done the simple calculation, and we're proposing to do the detailed calculation of where you could put solar and in Phoenix. The car parks, which have obvious advantages in all sorts of different ways, you know, are a 10 gigawatt opportunity in Phoenix. That's a larger electric power plant than either of the two utilities that serve this city. Their peak summer loads are not yet 10 gigawatts. So, you know, we have this tremendous opportunity, and it makes no sense not to take advantage of it, especially when we think about the ability to do resilience, the ability to do to create revenue streams that could enable and empower communities to do other good things in their lives, et cetera. So I think I think it makes total sense to do that. I just know we're not going to do it through legislation, and so we're going to have to figure out how to be more creative here.
We might call it quits there, Clark, because I am very aware of the time. It's just been fantastic to hear your presentation and to share some of the thinking. To me, it just reflects how important it is that we join the dots across countries, because I think we're all coming at it with a similar motivation, but there's so much that we can learn from this. So I know that it's fantastic that CSIRO is bringing you out here next week. I'm looking forward to catching up in person and continuing these conversations and all the questions I didn't ask. So
yeah,
thank you.
absolutely. I'm really looking forward to it too.
Yeah, no, it's great. So thank you for taking time out of your evening. Hi to the family, and we'll see you next week. And thanks everybody for joining and for your questions.
Thank you all for being here.
Yeah,
Really fun.
great. Take care.
Bye,
See you
Peta.
next week. Bye.